My unborn baby is holding a human eye. The state troopers found my Honda Civic 20 miles off the interstate, lodged in a ditch where the gravel service road gives way to the dense, unforgiving tree line of the Pacific Northwest. The windshield was shattered spider-webbed outward from a single violent impact point, and the steering wheel was slick with blood that had already begun to coagulate in the freezing January air. They didn't find a body, not mine and certainly not his, but what they would have found had they looked closely at the passenger seat floor mat was a grotesque piece of cartilage and fluid, a wet organic marble that used to be a left eye. I know they filed it as a domestic dispute gone wrong, a lover's quarrel that ended in a crash. They assume I'm dead in the woods or running from a felony charge. They don't know that I am sitting in a motel room 3 states away, scrubbing my skin with steel wool until it bleeds, trying to wash off the scent of that house. They don't know that the blood on the steering wheel wasn't mine, and they certainly don't understand that I didn't run away from a car accident. I ran away from a lineage that has been feeding on the naive and the lonely for generations. I left a piece of him behind, but I have a terrible sinking feeling that he left something inside of me. It started with the kind of aggressive perfection that should have terrified me, but instead it flattered me. Caleb had been in my life for exactly 31 days. In the modern dating landscape of ghosting and non-committal situationships, Caleb was an anomaly. He was intense, present, and overwhelmingly focused. He was a 26-year-old landscape architect with the jawline of a movie star and the gentle, eager-to-please demeanor of a golden retriever. He filled my apartment with flowers, he fixed the leaking faucet in my kitchen without being asked, and he listened to my rants about the chaotic parents at the preschool where I taught with an intensity that made me feel like the center of the universe. When he suggested we spend New Year's Eve at his family's estate up north near Blackwater Lake, I didn't hear the alarm bells. I heard an invitation to deepen a connection that felt like destiny. I was 24, lonely in a city that felt too big and desperate to believe that fairy tales could happen fast. The drive should have been the first warning. We left the city limits of Seattle under a slate-gray sky that promised snow, the kind of heavy, wet precipitation that muffles the world. Caleb drove his truck, a beast of a vehicle that smelled of pine air freshener and something else, something faintly metallic like old pennies, which I assumed was just the smell of his tools in the back. For the first hour we sang along to the radio, his hand resting heavily on my thigh. It was a comforting weight, or so I told myself. It was possessive anchoring. But as we merged onto Route 26 and began the ascent into the mountains, the atmosphere shifted. The radio signal didn't just fade, it was cut as if someone had taken a pair of shears to the frequency. 1 minute we were listening to a top 40 hit, and the next there was a sharp static hiss that made me jump, followed by absolute dead silence. Caleb didn't reach to turn it off or search for another station. He just gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening, and stared straight ahead into the thickening fog. "Service is spotty up here," he said, his voice flat. "We call it the dead zone. Dad says it's because of the iron deposits in the hills, messes with the signals. It feels heavy," I murmured, rubbing my ears. The pressure in the cabin had dropped, or maybe risen. I couldn't tell. It felt like being submerged underwater. My ears popped a painful, sharp click in my skull. "That's just the altitude, El." Caleb smiled, glancing at me. For a second, just a microsecond, his eyes didn't look like the warm hazel I had memorized. They looked black, dilated by the low light swallowing the iris. "You'll get used to it. The air is different here. It's cleaner. It clears out the lungs." We turned off the paved road onto a gravel track that wound through a forest so dense it felt like entering the throat of a massive animal. The trees here weren't the majestic evergreens of travel brochures. They were gnarled, twisted things, their branches interlocked overhead like skeletal fingers, shutting out the remaining daylight. Moss hung from them in gray, weeping curtains. I checked my phone. No bars. The little SOS icon appeared in the corner of the screen. I felt a spike of anxiety, the modern panic of disconnection, but I shoved it down. I was here to disconnect, wasn't I? I was here to meet the parents who had raised this perfect man. Almost there, Caleb whispered, and the reverence in his voice made me shiver. They've been waiting for you all day, Mom especially. She says she had a dream about you. A dream? I laughed nervously. She's never met me. Mom has intuition, Caleb said. She knows things before they happen. She knew I met someone special before I even called her. She said the lake told her. I laughed again, expecting him to join in to say he was joking. He didn't. He just kept driving the gravel, crunching loudly under the tires, a rhythmic grinding sound that sounded like bones breaking. The house revealed itself not as a welcoming homestead, but as a looming fortress of dark wood and stone. It sat in a clearing that felt unnatural, as if the forest had been terrified into receding. The structure was Victorian in style, but stripped of any charm. The paint, once perhaps a deep blue, had weathered into a bruised, necrotic black. The windows were tall and narrow, devoid of shutters staring out at the driveway like empty sockets. A wraparound porch sagged under the weight of years, and the entire structure seemed to lean slightly toward the massive body of water behind it, Blackwater Lake. Even in the dim twilight, the lake was terrifying. The water wasn't blue or gray. It was a flat, vantablack void that absorbed the light. It didn't ripple. It just sat there heavy and silent, a liquid obsidian mirror. Before Caleb could even kill the engine, the front door burst open. I expected a frantic, happy greeting, perhaps a dog running out. Instead, a woman stepped onto the porch. She was large, not just in weight, but in presence, taking up space with a suffocating authority. She wore a floral dress that looked decades out of style, covered by a stained apron. Her hair was pulled back so tightly against her scalp that it pulled her eyebrows up, giving her a permanent expression of manic surprise. "Jenny!" she shrieked. Her voice was shrill, piercing through the damp air. "It's Elena," I whispered to Caleb as we unbuckled. "She gets names mixed up, don't worry about it," Caleb muttered, his demeanor changing instantly. He seemed to shrink. His shoulders hunched, his confidence evaporating. He wasn't the strong protector anymore. He was a boy coming home to mother. I stepped out of the truck and the cold hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't a crisp winter chill. It was a damp, seeping cold that went straight to the marrow. I wrapped my coat tighter, but before I could take a step, Martha Caleb's mother was on me. She didn't hug me. She collided with me, her arms thick and hard as tree roots wrapped around my torso, pinning my arms to my sides. She squeezed the air, leaving my lungs in a startled huff. But then she did something that made my skin crawl. She buried her face in the crook of my neck and inhaled. It was a long, wet, rattling sniff, like a hound catching a scent. I could feel her nose cold against my skin, her breath hot and smelling of something sour like milk left out in the sun too long. "Martha, you're crushing her," Caleb said. But he made no move to pull her off. He was standing by the truck watching us with a strange, detached smile. Martha pulled back, holding me at arm's length. Her hands were incredibly strong, her fingers digging into my biceps through the layers of my wool coat. She looked me up and down, her eyes darting frantically over my body, my hips, my waist, my chest. It wasn't a look of judgment on my fashion. It was an appraisal. It was the way a butcher looks at a side of beef, estimating the yield. "You're thinner than the pictures." She clicked her tongue, a wet sound against the roof of her mouth. "But the structure is good. Wide pelvis." "Good hips. Excuse me," I stammered, trying to pull away, but her grip was iron. She leaned in close, her eyes widening, the pupils pinpricks. "For the family, dear. Strong stock makes strong branches. You have the look of a survivor. Are you a survivor, Elena?" I guess." I looked at Caleb, pleading silently for help. "Mom, let her breathe," Caleb said, finally stepping up and placing a hand on her shoulder. She flinched at his touch, then swatted his hand away playfully, though the slap echoed loud enough to sting. "Get the bags, Caleb. Don't be rude. Bring her inside. The stew is thickening." She released me abruptly and turned marching back into the dark maw of the house without looking back. "She's intense," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "She's just excited," Caleb said, grabbing my suitcase. "She's been lonely. We don't get many visitors out here. The road washes out in the spring and gets snowed in during winter." "You're the first guest we've had in 3 years." "3 years?" I asked. "But you said you brought your ex here last Christmas." Caleb froze. His back was to me as he reached into the truck bed. For a second, the silence of the forest seemed to amplify the wind dying down, as if the trees were listening. He turned around slowly, his face composed into a mask of confusion. "I never said that, Elle. You must be confusing me with one of your Tinder dates." He chuckled, but the sound was hollow. "Come on. You don't want to keep Amos waiting. He gets grumpy when the schedule slips." I followed him up the porch steps, the wood groaning in protest under my boots. I tried to replay the memory in my head. I was sure he had told me about bringing a girl named Sarah here. He had mentioned they went ice skating on the lake. But his denial was so casual, so absolute, that I felt a flicker of doubt. Maybe I had imagined it. Gaslighting is subtle when it starts. It feels like you're losing your footing on a slippery slope you didn't know you were standing on. The interior of the house was an assault on the senses. The moment I crossed the threshold, the smell hit me. It was a complex, layering stench. Underneath the overpowering aroma of cinnamon wax melts and pine needles, there was something undeniably organic and rotting. It smelled like wet earth, old blood, and raw meat. It was the smell of a butcher shop that had been scrubbed with bleach but couldn't quite mask the history of slaughter. The hallway was dimly lit by sconces that flickered with weak yellow bulbs. The wallpaper was a peeling damask pattern, dark crimson and gold, that looked like dried scabs picking away from the skin of the walls. But it was the silence of the house that was most unnerving. Despite Martha being just ahead of us, there was no sound of television, no music, no hum of a refrigerator. Just the settling of the house itself, the wood contracting in the cold. "Take your shoes off," Caleb whispered. "Dad hates dirt." I toed off my boots, feeling the floorboards cold through my socks. We walked into the living room, a cavernous space dominated by a massive stone fireplace where a fire roared with unnatural ferocity. The logs didn't crackle, they hissed. Standing by the fire was a man who could only be Amos. He was gargantuan, his back to us, his silhouette blocking out the light of the flames. He was staring into the fire, motionless. But my eyes were drawn to the walls. They were covered floor to ceiling in framed photographs, hundreds of them. They were all black and white regardless of the era. They depicted couples, a man and a woman standing stiffly side by side in front of this very fireplace. The men in the photos changed different hairstyles, different suits, aging through the decades from the 1920s to the present. But the women all looked disturbingly similar. Not physically, some were tall, some short, some fair, some dark, but their expressions were identical. Every single woman in the photos had eyes that were wide open, staring straight into the camera lens with a look of utter paralyzed terror. Their mouths were closed, their hands clasped tightly in front of their stomachs. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Caleb dropped the bags by the sofa. "Ancestors, relatives. It's the family tree." I stepped closer to one of the photos. It looked recent, maybe from the 90s. The woman in the photo was wearing an oversized sweater, her hair frizzy. She looked like she had been crying. Her eyes were red-rimmed even in monochrome. "She looks afraid," I said. "Caleb, they all look terrified." "It's just the exposure time," Caleb said, coming up behind me. He stood too close, his chest pressing against my back. Old cameras required you to hold your breath and keep your eyes open so you didn't blink. It makes everyone look a little deer in the headlights. Don't overanalyze it, babe. You're the teacher always looking for meaning. "That one isn't old." I pointed to a photo near the edge of the frame. "That looks like... Is that digital?" Elena. Caleb's voice dropped an octave. It wasn't a warning, but a command. Stop! Before I could respond, a sound from the corner of the room made me jump. It was a wet, slurping noise, like a boot being pulled out of mud. I turned and saw a figure sitting in a high-backed armchair in the deepest shadow of the room. That's Uncle Silas, Caleb said, his tone dismissive. Silas was a wiry, jagged man who looked like he had been assembled from spare parts. He was wearing a suit that was too large for him, the cuffs frayed. He was balding with wisps of greasy hair plastered across a spotted scalp. But it was his face that froze the blood in my veins. He was watching me with a hunger that was palpable. He held a glass of dark liquid in his hand, and as I looked at him, he ran a tongue surprisingly long and pale over his lower lip. He didn't speak. He just stared. His gaze started at my face and slowly, deliberately slid down to my torso, lingering on my stomach. "Hello," I managed to choke out. Silas didn't answer. He just raised his glass slightly in a mock toast, his eyes never leaving my midsection. "Don't mind him," Caleb said, guiding me away. "He had a stroke a few years back. Can't talk much, just watches. He's looking at me like—" I couldn't finish the sentence. "Like I'm food. He's just admiring you, Elle. You're beautiful. We don't see beauty out here. We see survival." "Dinner." Martha's voice boomed from the kitchen, startling me again. "Come now. The meat waits for no one." "I need to use the restroom first," I said, desperate for a moment of separation. I needed to breathe. I needed to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that this was just a weird, eccentric country family and not the opening scene of a horror movie. "Down the hall, second door on the left," Caleb said. "Don't take too long. Dad hates cold food." I hurried down the hallway, the floorboards screaming under my weight. I found the bathroom and locked the door behind me. The lock was a flimsy hook-and-eye mechanism that looked like it could be snapped with a firm tug. I turned on the faucet, splashing freezing cold water on my face. The water smelled of sulfur and rust. I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wide. I looked just like the women in the photos. I shook my head, slapping my cheeks. "Get it together, Elena. It's New Year's Eve. Be polite, eat dinner, leave in the morning." I reached for a hand towel and noticed the window above the toilet. It was small, frosted glass. I felt a sudden urge to see the outside world, to confirm that my car was still there, that the road still existed. I stood on the toilet lid and peered through a clear spot in the glass. The view looked out over the back of the house toward the lake. The fog had lowered, hugging the ground. But through the mist I saw something standing by the water's edge. It was a structure, a wooden archway decorated with what looked like antlers and ribbons, and standing beneath it facing the house was a group of figures. Scarecrows. No, they were too distinct. They were statues. I squinted, wiping the condensation from the glass. One of the figures moved. It was just a twitch, a shift in posture, but it was unmistakable. There were people standing by the lake, in the freezing cold, in the dark, facing the house, waiting. I gasped and stepped back, my foot slipping on the porcelain lid. I caught myself on the sink. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Who are they? Why didn't Caleb mention guests?" I tried to open the window to get a better look, to hear if they were talking. I pushed up on the sash. It didn't budge. I pushed harder. Nothing. I looked closely at the frame. The window hadn't just been painted shut. Heavy, rusted iron nails had been driven through the sash into the frame at 4-inch intervals. The heads of the nails were stripped scarred, as if they had been hammered in with frantic, violent force. This wasn't weatherproofing. This was a cage. I traced the head of one of the nails, the cold metal biting into my fingertip. A sudden realization hit me. A cold, dawning horror that bypassed logic and went straight to instinct. The nails were on the inside. Someone had nailed this window shut from the inside of the bathroom, not to keep people out, but to keep something or someone from getting out. "Elena," Caleb's voice came from right outside the door, his knuckles rapping sharply on the wood. "Everything okay in there? You've been in there a long time." I jumped, nearly screaming. I'm coming, just fixing my makeup." "Good," Caleb said. His voice was pressed right against the crack of the door. "We're all waiting. The family is all here." I looked back at the nailed-shut window, then at the flimsy lock on the door. I took a deep breath, forcing a smile onto my face that didn't reach my eyes, and unlocked the door. When I opened it, Caleb was standing there. He was smiling, but his eyes were fixed on my stomach, just like Uncle Silas. "You smell nice," he said, leaning in to sniff my hair, mimicking his mother. "You smell like potential." "Let's eat," I said, my voice brittle. As we walked back toward the dining room, I glanced at the front door. The heavy oak door was closed now, and resting across it was a massive wooden beam, a barricade that hadn't been there when we entered. "Drafts," Caleb said, noticing my gaze without looking at me. "Keeps the cold out." "Right," I said. "Drafts." But as I stepped into the dining room where Martha was ladling a thick gray sludge onto plates, I knew it wasn't the cold they were worried about. And it wasn't just the drafts they were keeping out. They were keeping me in. And the look on Uncle Silas's face as I took my seat confirmed my worst fear. The main course wasn't on the table yet. It had just sat down. The dining room was a mausoleum of silence, broken only by the wet, rhythmic sound of Martha ladling the stew onto heavy ceramic plates. The sound was obscene, a thick, suctioning plop, followed by a slow slide of viscous matter. The chandelier above the table, a wrought iron monstrosity adorned with real dripping wax candles, cast long dancing shadows against the walls. Those shadows seemed to stretch and contort, mimicking the shapes of the terrified women in the photographs that lined the room, their silent screams magnified by the flickering light. I sat between Caleb and Uncle Silas. The chair was high-backed, carved from a wood so dark it looked charred, and the velvet cushions smelled of dust and something muskier like dried sweat. Directly across from me sat Amos, Caleb's father. He hadn't moved since we entered the room. His hands, massive and covered in liver spots, and thick wire-like hair rested flat on the tablecloth. He wasn't looking at me, but I felt his attention. It was a physical weight pressing against my forehead, a heavy static pressure like the air before a lightning strike. "Eat," Martha said, placing a bowl in front of me. She didn't sit. She stood behind Amos's chair, her hands gripping the backrest so tightly her knuckles were white. "The lake provides. We do not waste what the water gives." I looked down at the bowl. The stew was a color that shouldn't exist in cuisine, a dull bruised gray with streaks of oily black swirling on the surface. Chunks of unidentifiable meat bobbed in the thick gravy alongside root vegetables that looked pale and sickly. It didn't steam, it just sat there exuding a faint cloying heat. The smell was overpowering now up close. It smelled of brine, of deep, stagnant water, and underneath that the unmistakable copper tang of raw iron. "Thank you, Martha," I said, my voice sounding small and foreign in the cavernous room. "It looks hearty." "It binds us," Amos rumbled. His voice was deep tectonic, vibrating through the wood of the table and up into my ribcage. He finally lifted his eyes to meet mine. They were a watery pale blue, milky with cataracts, or age yet piercing. "In the city you eat dead things, processed things, plastic wrapped in plastic. Here we eat the life of the land. It makes the blood thick. Does your blood run thick, Elena?" The question hung in the air, absurd and menacing. I suppose I have normal blood pressure," I tried to joke, picking up my spoon. The silver was heavy, tarnished, almost black and cold to the touch. "Blood remembers," Amos continued, ignoring my attempt at levity. "Blood is a record. When you eat this, you are writing our history into your veins. You become part of the cycle." Caleb nudged my knee under the table. "Dad's just saying it's a family recipe, El. Don't be polite, dig in." He shoveled a spoonful of the gray sludge into his mouth, chewing with exaggerated gusto. I watched his throat work the swallow audible in the quiet room. He smiled at me, a fleck of gray gravy on his lip. "It's better than it looks. It's venison. And local herbs." I took a breath, held it, and lifted the spoon to my lips. My survival instinct was screaming at me to throw the bowl across the room, to run to the door and tear down the barricade. But social conditioning is a powerful cage. We are taught not to be rude. We are taught to be good guests. So I put the spoon in my mouth. The taste was a shock to the system. It was incredibly salty, gritty like sand, and the meat was tough, stringy, and gamey. But worse than the taste was the temperature. It was lukewarm, the temperature of a feverish body. I forced myself to chew the gristle, resisting my teeth. As I swallowed, I felt the heavy lump slide down my esophagus, a cold stone dropping into my stomach. "Good?" Martha asked, leaning forward, her face looming out of the shadows. "Different," I managed to say, reaching for my water glass. The water was room temperature and tasted of metal, very earthy. "The soil here is rich," Silas spoke for the first time. His voice was a wet rasp, as if his throat was lined with mucus, full of nutrients, full of leftovers. I froze the glass halfway to my mouth. I turned to look at him. He was grinning, revealing gums that were receding and teeth that were yellow and jagged like broken pottery. He wasn't eating. He was just watching me chew, his eyes tracking the movement of my jaw muscles. "Uncle Silas used to be a butcher," Caleb said quickly, cutting a piece of meat with jagged precision. "He has a weird sense of humor about organic matter. Ignore him." I tried to focus on my plate, counting the seconds. 1 bite, 2 bites. Just get through the meal, then say you have a headache. Go to bed, leave at first light. But the house had other plans. About 5 minutes into the meal, I felt something brush against my ankle under the table. I shifted my leg, thinking I had bumped the table leg. A moment later, it happened again. A slow, deliberate slide up my calf. I stiffened, dropping my spoon with a clatter. "Slippery fingers?" Amos asked, not looking up from his bowl. "Sorry," I murmured. I looked at Caleb. He was focused entirely on his food eating with a mechanical rhythm. The touch returned. This time there was no mistaking it. It was a foot. A shoeless foot, the rough calluses of the heel dragging against my nylon tights, the toes wiggling as they pressed into the soft flesh of my calf. It was cold and hard, like a dead branch. I shot a look at Silas. He was staring straight ahead, humming a low, discordant tune under his breath, his hands resting innocently on the table. But his leg was angled toward me. I kicked out hard, aiming for his shin. My boot connected with something solid. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just turned his head slowly toward me, his grin widening until it seemed to split his face. He winked, a slow, agonizing closure of one eyelid while the other remained fixed on my chest. "Caleb," I whispered, leaning toward him. "Caleb, please." "What?" Caleb asked, his mouth full. "Your uncle?" I hissed, my voice trembling with a mix of rage and terror. "He's touching me. Under the table." Caleb stopped chewing. He swallowed slowly. He looked at me, then at Silas, then back to his plate. "He has restless leg syndrome, El," Caleb said, his voice devoid of empathy. "The stroke messed up his nerves. He doesn't know what he's doing. Just move your leg." "He's not twitching, Caleb. He's rubbing his foot on me. He knows exactly what he's doing." "Don't make a scene." Caleb snapped the golden retriever mask, slipping entirely to reveal something cold and reptilian beneath. "Not in front of Dad. Just eat your food. You're insulting Martha." I looked at him, horror dawning. This wasn't just a bad boyfriend moment. This was permission. He was allowing it. He was part of it. I shifted my chair as far away from Silas as I could, pressing my side against Caleb's. The foot stopped, but the feeling of violation lingered, a phantom pressure on my skin. "So, Elena?" Amos's voice boomed again, drawing my attention back to the head of the table. He had finished his stew. His bowl was licked clean. "Tell us about your stock." "My stock." "Your people," Amos clarified. "Your parents, are they healthy? Do they have all their teeth? Any history of madness? Any history of defiance?" "My parents are professors," I said, trying to regain some composure. "They are very healthy. My mother teaches philosophy and my father teaches history." "Intellectuals." Martha spat the word like a curse from behind Amos's chair. Heads in the clouds, weak hands, soft bodies. The mind is a tool, Amos corrected her gently, but with an undercurrent of menace. But the body is the vessel. We are interested in the vessel. Tell me, Elena, are you regular? Excuse me, I choked. Your cycles, Amos said, leaning forward. Are they consistent like the moon, or are they chaotic? That is none of your business, I said, my voice rising. I couldn't help it. The fear was turning into a sharp, defensive anger. That is an incredibly inappropriate question to ask a guest. The table went silent. Even the fire seemed to hush. Silas stopped humming. Martha stopped swaying. Caleb put down his fork. Amos stared at me. For a long moment, nobody breathed. Then Amos threw his head back and laughed. It was a dry, barking sound like a fox screaming in the night. She has fire, good fire cleanses, fire strengthens the iron. He slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. She is not a sheep, Caleb. You brought home a wolf. A small wolf, but a wolf nonetheless. This will make the taming sweeter. Taming, I whispered. Marriage is a taming, is it not? Amos smiled, revealing teeth that were too small for his massive jaw. Two wild spirits broken against each other until they fit, until they are one, until they serve the covenant. I think I'm done eating, I said, pushing my bowl away. It was still half full. You are not done, Martha said, stepping out from behind the chair. She moved with surprising speed for a woman of her size. She was beside me in an instant, her hand landing on my shoulder. You must finish. It is the offering. To leave food is to insult the provider. I'm full, I said, trying to shrug her off, but her grip was like a vice. Her fingers dug into my trapezius muscle, finding the pressure point. Pain shot down my arm. Eat, she whispered in my ear. Her breath smelled of the stew-rotten meat and iron. The baby needs nutrients. What baby? I cried out, trying to stand up, but her hand slammed me back down into the chair. The potential, Caleb said calmly, not looking at me. He was staring at his empty bowl as if reading the future in the gravy smears. Just eat it, Elena. Please, it makes things easier. I looked around the table. Silas was licking his lips. Amos was watching with the detached interest of a scientist observing a lab rat. Caleb was looking away. Martha was pinning me down. I was trapped. Fine, I said, tears stinging my eyes. Fine. I picked up the spoon. My hand was shaking so badly the gray sludge sloshed over the sides. I took a mouthful. Swallow, don't taste, just swallow. I took another, and another. On the fourth bite, my teeth crunched down on something hard. It wasn't grit. It wasn't a peppercorn. It was solid, calcified. I stopped chewing. Swallow, Martha commanded, her fingers digging deeper into my shoulder. I tried to manipulate the object with my tongue. It was small, jagged on one end, smooth on the top. It felt like a crown, a molar. Panic flared in my chest, white-hot and blinding. There was a tooth in my food. I gagged. My hand flew to my mouth. Don't you dare, Amos growled. Don't you dare reject the gift. Swallow it, Elena. Caleb said, his voice tight with panic now. Do not spit it out. Trust me. Just swallow it. I looked at Caleb. His eyes were wide, terrified. For the first time I realized he wasn't just part of this. He was afraid of them, too. He was afraid of what would happen if I broke the rules. I closed my eyes. I thought of the car keys in Caleb's pocket. I thought of the nail-gunned window. I thought of the long, dark road. Survival meant compliance, for now. I gulped. The object scraped the back of my throat, a sharp, painful reminder of its reality, before sliding down into the darkness of my stomach. Good girl, Martha cooed, finally releasing my shoulder. She stroked my hair, her touch suddenly gentle, almost loving. See, you are part of us now. You have the ancestors inside you. I felt sick, not just nauseous, but spiritually violated. I had consumed something that had once been part of another human being. I pushed the chair back the legs, screeching against the floorboards. I need to use the bathroom, I said, my voice hollow. I think the richness of the food. Of course, Amos said, waving a hand dismissively. Purge if you must. But the essence remains. The essence always remains. I stood up, my legs trembling. I walked out of the dining room feeling their eyes on my back like lasers. As I crossed the threshold into the hallway, I heard Silas speak. His voice was clearer this time, less raspy, as if the excitement had lubricated his vocal cords. "She has good marrow," he said. "Sweet marrow." I broke into a run, stumbling down the dark corridor. I reached the bathroom and slammed the door, fumbling with the flimsy lock until it clicked. I collapsed against the sink, dry heaving. Nothing came up. The stew sat heavy in my gut, an anchor dragging me down. I splashed water on my face again, trying to scrub away the feeling of Martha's hand, the sensation of Silas's foot, the taste of the tooth. I looked into the mirror, and I screamed. It was a silent scream choked off in my throat. In the mirror, my reflection was standing still. I had pulled back from the sink, my hands clutching my chest. But in the glass reflection, Elena was still leaning forward, hands on the porcelain rim, staring down into the drain. I froze. I stopped breathing. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the reflection lifted its head. It happened a full 3 seconds after I had moved. The face that looked back at me was mine, but the eyes were wrong. They were dead, flat, like the eyes of the women in the photographs. And then the reflection smiled. It wasn't my smile. It was a smile of utter hopeless despair. The reflection mouthed a single word: "Run." I squeezed my eyes shut, counting to 10. 1, 2, 3. "You are hallucinating. It's the stress. It's the carbon monoxide from the fireplace. It's not real." When I opened my eyes, the mirror was normal. My reflection moved with me, mimicking my terrified trembling perfectly. "Get a grip," I whispered. "Find a phone. Get out." I remembered seeing a landline unit on a small table in the hallway near the supply closet. I unlocked the door, slowly peering out. The hallway was empty. The voices from the dining room were a low murmur, indistinguishable. I crept down the hall, my socks sliding silently on the wood. I reached the little alcove with the phone. It was an old rotary model, heavy black plastic. I picked up the receiver. Silence. Not a dial tone, just dead heavy air. I followed the cord. It snaked down the side of the table and along the baseboard. About 2 feet from the wall, the cord ended. It hadn't been cut with scissors. It had been chewed. The plastic casing was gnawed, the copper wires frayed and snapped, covered in dried saliva. I dropped the receiver. It swung on its cord, hitting the wall with a dull thud. Chewed. A shadow moved at the end of the hallway. I spun around. It was Caleb. He was standing in the doorway of the dining room, backlit by the flickering candlelight. He was holding something in his hand. A small velvet box. "Elena," he called out softly. "Dessert is ready. Mom made cake." "The phone is dead," I said, my voice sounding far away. "The storm," Caleb said, walking toward me. His movement was fluid, predatory. "I told you, the lines go down all the time." "The cord is chewed, Caleb. Something chewed through the cord." He stopped a few feet away from me. In the dim light, his face was a mask of sorrow and determination. "Mice," he said. "We have big field mice. They get hungry in the winter. Field mice don't chew through copper wire." I stepped back, my back hitting the wall. "Who are those people by the lake, Caleb? Who are the ancestors? What did I just eat?" Caleb closed the distance between us. He reached out and cupped my face. His hands were warm, smelling of that damn stew. "It doesn't matter anymore, El," he whispered. "You're here. You're part of the chain now. Don't fight it. Fighting makes it hurt. Just accept it. Dad says if you accept it, the transition is euphoric, like drowning." Painful for a moment, then peace. "I want to go home," I sobbed. "You are home," Caleb said. He leaned his forehead against mine. "This is the only home that matters. Now come. The cake is red velvet, your favorite. Mom made it just for you. We have to do the ring ceremony before midnight. The water is rising." "What?" "The lake," he said, as if it were obvious. "It rises on New Year's Eve. It comes to the porch steps. It comes to greet the bride." He took my hand. His grip was firm, inescapable. He wasn't pulling me exactly, but guiding me with an insistent force that brooked no argument. "Come," he said. I looked at the front door. The heavy wooden bar was still in place. I looked at the back of the house where the nailed windows were. I looked at Caleb, the man I thought I loved, who was now leading me to my execution, or worse, my induction. I let him lead me back toward the dining room. As we walked, I felt a strange sensation in my stomach. The heavy lump of the stew seemed to be moving, shifting, reacting to the proximity of the lake. It felt like I had swallowed a handful of tadpoles and they were waking up. We re-entered the dining room. The atmosphere had shifted. The air was charged with electricity. Amos was standing now, holding a long, serrated knife. Martha was lighting more candles, humming a melody that sounded like the wind through dead trees. Silas was drumming his fingers on the table, a frantic staccato rhythm. On the center of the table sat the cake. It was a masterpiece of grotesquerie, frosting the color of fresh arterial blood dripping down the sides of a cake that looked black as coal, and written in the center in looping, elegant script that looked like it had been carved rather than piped, "Welcome to the Bloodline." "Sit," Amos commanded, pointing to my chair with the knife. I sat. "Now," Amos smiled, and for the first time I saw the true depth of the madness in his eyes. It wasn't just fanaticism. It was possession. "We begin the binding. Midnight approaches. The vessel must be sealed." He placed the velvet box in front of Caleb. "Ask her, my son. Ask her to give us her soul." Caleb picked up the box. He turned to me. He opened the lid. Inside sat a ring. It was silver, tarnished to black. And the stone. The stone wasn't a diamond. It wasn't a ruby. It was a piece of polished obsidian, dark and depthless as the lake itself. And as I looked at it, I swore I saw something swimming deep inside the stone. "Elena," Caleb began, his voice trembling. He dropped to one knee. The floorboards groaned, sounding like a chorus of voices from beneath the house. I looked at the knife in Amos's hand. I looked at the manic glee on Martha's face. I looked at the hunger in Silas's eyes, and I realized something. I wasn't going to leave this house, not as Elena. If I wanted to survive, Elena had to die. I had to become something else, something sharper, something cruel. "Ask me," I whispered, my hand drifting slowly toward the heavy silver fork resting on the dessert plate. "Ask me, Caleb." The shadows on the wall seemed to lean in, waiting for the answer. The house held its breath. The lake water lapped against the porch steps, outside a wet, slapping sound like applause. The trap was sprung. The feast was over. Now came the sacrifice. Caleb took a breath, tears leaking from his eyes, and began to speak the words that would end my life or begin my nightmare. "Will you bind yourself to the Blackwater? Will you take this ring and with it the burden of our blood?" I wrapped my fingers around the cold handle of the fork. I started, my voice shaking. "I need my parents to see this." It was the only lie I had left. And as the words left my mouth, I prayed to whatever God was listening, not the one in the lake, but the one above the clouds, that they would buy it. Because if they didn't, I knew exactly where that serrated knife in Amos's hand was going to end up. Amos froze. Martha stopped humming. Silas stopped drumming. They looked at me. And the second conflict began, not of the body but of the mind, the game of belief. "Your parents?" Amos asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Yes," I lied, gripping the fork until my knuckles turned white. "They're on their way." The silence that followed was louder than any scream, and in that silence I prepared to kill the man I loved. The lie hung suspended in the stagnant air of the dining room, a fragile shield raised against a battalion of monsters. "They're on their way." I had spoken the words with a desperation that tasted like copper and bile, praying that the absurdity of the statement would be masked by the sheer conviction of my terror. Amos didn't blink. The massive serrated knife in his hand lowered slightly, the tip pointing toward the floorboards, but his grip didn't loosen. The fire in the hearth snapped a loud gunshot crack that made Caleb flinch. but the patriarch remained frozen, a gargoyle of suspicion carved from granite and malice. "Your parents?" Amos repeated the words, rolling around his mouth like stones. "The philosophy professor and the historian. They are driving through a Class 5 blizzard up a mountain road that has been closed since noon to witness a ceremony they know nothing about." He took a step toward me. The floorboards groaned in protest. They value tradition." I stammered, my hand tightening around the cold, heavy silver of the dessert fork hidden in the folds of my dress. I could feel the tines pressing into my thigh, a sharp, grounding pain. "I told them about us. I told them that this was serious. They wanted to be here. They said a union without the ancestors of both lines is hollow. Isn't that what you believe?" I was gambling on their fanaticism. I was betting my life that their obsession with rules and rituals was stronger than their bloodlust. Amos looked at Martha. The older woman was vibrating with a chaotic energy, her eyes darting between me and the window where the storm battered the glass with the fury of 1,000 fists. "A hollow union." Martha whispered the words, whistling through her teeth. She looked horrified by the concept. "Amos, if the vessel is not properly witnessed, if the chain is weak—" "Silence," Amos hissed. He turned his milky, dead-blue gaze back to me. "You are lying, girl. I can smell the deceit on you. It smells like sour milk, like fear." He moved. It wasn't the lumbering gait of an old man. It was a sudden violent surge. Before I could scramble back, his hand size of a catcher's mitt and rough as sandpaper shot out and clamped around my jaw. He squeezed, forcing my mouth open, tilting my head back until my neck screamed in protest. "Look at her eyes," Amos roared, staring deep into my pupils. "There is no family coming. There is only the prey trying to bargain with the butcher." He shoved me backward. I slammed into the high back of the chair, the wood digging into my spine. "Bind her," Amos commanded, his voice shaking the crystal drops on the chandelier. "Midnight is 5 minutes away. The lake is hungry. We do not wait for ghosts." Chaos erupted. It wasn't a disorganized scuffle. It was a coordinated assault practiced and perfected over God knows how many victims. Martha was on me first. For a woman of her bulk, she moved with the terrifying, suffocating speed of an avalanche. She lunged over the arm of my chair, her weight pinning my upper body against the wood. Her hands, smelling of the iron blood stew, clamped onto my shoulders. Her thumbs dug into the soft hollows of my collarbone, paralyzing my arms. "Don't fight, little mother," she cooed, her face inches from mine, spittle flying from her lips. "The struggle makes the meat sour. Accept the yoke. Accept the love." "Get off me!" I screamed, thrashing my legs, kicking out blindly under the table. My boot connected with something a shin, a knee, but it didn't stop them. Uncle Silas slid from his chair like a spider, scuttling under the table. I felt his cold, dry hands wrap around my ankles. He wasn't just holding them, he was binding them. I heard the zip of plastic cable ties, then the biting pain as he cinched them tight around my boots, locking my legs together. "Caleb!" I shrieked, looking for the man who had driven me here, the man who had held my hand in the movies, the man I had thought I loved. "Caleb, help me, please." Caleb stood by the centerpiece holding the velvet box. He was crying. Silent, streaming tears tracked through the sweat on his face. He looked at me with an expression of utter devastation, but he didn't move to help. He moved to comply. "I'm sorry, Elle," he sobbed, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry, but you have to understand. It's the only way to save you. If you don't take the ring, the lake takes all of you." He stepped forward, taking my left hand. I tried to make a fist to claw at him, but Amos stepped in. He grabbed my wrist, his grip crushing the delicate bones of my hand. He forced my fingers open, flattening my palm against the tablecloth. "The ring, Caleb," Amos ordered. "Now!" "No, no!" I screamed, thrashing my head from side to side, trying to bite Martha's arm, trying to headbutt Amos. "This is insane. You're all insane. It is the covenant," Amos bellowed, grabbing the serrated knife with his free hand. He brought the blade down not on me, but on his own palm. He sliced a deep diagonal gash across his lifeline. Black blood welled up, too dark, too thick. He let the blood drip onto the obsidian stone of the ring sitting in the box. "Blood calls to blood," Amos chanted, his voice dropping into a guttural register that vibrated in my teeth. "Shadow calls to shadow. We bind this daughter of the earth to the sons of the deep." Caleb picked up the ring. It was slick now with his father's blood. "Elena," Caleb whispered, looming over me. "Just let it happen. It burns at first. It burns like hell, but then you see everything. You see the beauty of the bottom." He brought the ring to my ring finger. I summoned every ounce of adrenaline left in my body. I lunged forward, snapping my teeth at Caleb's face. I caught the fleshy part of his thumb and bit down, hard-tasting salt and iron. Caleb yelped, dropping the ring. It hit the table with a heavy, dull thud, not ringing like metal but landing like a stone. "You bitch!" Silas screeched from under the table, driving a fist into my thigh. Amos didn't tolerate the delay. He backhanded me. The blow was massive, like being hit with a shovel. My head snapped to the side, stars exploding in my vision. The taste of my own blood filled my mouth, hot and metallic. "Enough play," Amos growled. He grabbed the ring from the table. "Hold her hand flat." Martha put her entire body weight on my chest, squeezing the air out of my lungs. I wheezed, black spots dancing in my eyes. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't fight. Amos grabbed my ring finger. He didn't slide the ring on gently, he jammed it down. The moment the obsidian band touched my skin, I didn't feel cold metal. I felt fire. It wasn't a metaphor. It felt as if he was sliding a loop of white-hot wire onto my finger. The pain was absolute, blinding, white-out agony. I tried to scream, but with Martha crushing my lungs, it came out as a strangled, gurgling gasp. The ring slid past the knuckle. It tightened on its own. I could feel it shrinking, the metal constricting, biting into the flesh until it hit bone. "It is done," Martha shrieked in ecstasy, lifting her weight slightly so I could suck in a desperate, ragged breath. "She is wed. She is wed to the water." I lay there gasping, tears streaming down my face, my hand throbbing with a pulse that felt alien. I looked at the ring. The blood on it was sizzling, evaporating into a foul-smelling steam. The black stone was glowing with a faint rhythmic pulse. Thump, 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 thump. It matched the beating of my own heart. "Now," Amos said, wiping his bleeding hand on his trousers, "the consummation. The bride must be presented to the water." "No," I whispered, my voice wrecked. "No, please." "Caleb," Amos commanded, "take your wife to the porch. The water waits at the stairs." Caleb stepped forward, wiping his tears. He looked relieved now, as if the violence was the hard part and the rest was just formality. He reached for me. "Wait," I rasped. The word came out like dragging gravel. I had to think. I had to think through the pain, through the concussion, through the terror. The ring was on. I couldn't get it off. But I wasn't dead yet. And I still had the fork. I had dropped it during the struggle. I could feel it pressing against my hip, trapped between my body and the side of the chair. I hadn't lost it. "Wait," I said louder, forcing my voice to be steady. You broke the seal." Amos paused, his hand halfway to the knife he had left on the table. "What babble is this?" "The witness," I gasped, looking Amos dead in the eye. "You did the binding, without the witnesses. You said blood remembers." I swallowed the taste of blood mixing with the lingering flavor of the stew. If my parents arrive and find the door barred and the ritual finished, I improvised, weaving a logic out of their own madness. They will break the circle. They are powerful too. In their own way, if they interrupt the consummation, the energy will backlash. You know this. You know the laws of the ritual. I saw a flicker of doubt in Amos's eyes. Not fear of the police, but fear of magic. Fear of doing the spell wrong. "She speaks nonsense," Silas hissed from the floor, crawling out and standing up. He wiped dust from his oversized suit. "Let's toss her in and be done." "No," Caleb interrupted. He looked at his father. "Dad, she has a point. If the chain is broken, if the external energy isn't welcomed, Remember what happened to Aunt Lydia when the circle wasn't closed? Amos flinched. The name Lydia clearly held weight. A mistake from the past, a horror they remembered. The parents, Amos muttered, looking at the door. If they are truly coming, if they are truly bringing the old blood. They are, I lied, pouring every ounce of my soul into the deception. They called me, just before we lost signal. They were 5 miles out. They should be here any second. I looked at the grandfather clock in the corner. 11:58. If they knock and we don't answer. I let the threat hang. Amos stood still, the gears of his fanaticism grinding against each other. Finally he nodded, a sharp jerking motion. Caleb, take her to the door, check the driveway. If they are there, invite them in. If they are not, Amos picked up the knife again. Then you cut her throat on the threshold and push her in. Okay, Caleb breathed. Okay. Cut the ties on her legs, Amos ordered Silas. She needs to walk to her destiny. Silas grumbled but knelt down. I felt the cold blade of a pocket knife press against my ankle, then the snap of the plastic ties. My legs were free. Stand up, Elena, Caleb said softly. He offered me his hand. I didn't take it. I pushed myself up, my body screaming in pain. My shoulder felt bruised to the bone. My jaw ached where Amos had grabbed me. My left hand, the hand with the ring, felt heavy, dragging down as if the ring weighed 50 pounds. I stood. I wobbled. I can walk, I said. I want to greet my parents. I'll help you, Caleb said, moving to my side. He wrapped an arm around my waist. It felt supportive, almost tender, which made it all the more sickening. He was walking me to the slaughterhouse with the gentleness of a lover. Go, Martha said, standing by the kitchen door, watching us with hungry eyes. But be quick. The water is rising fast. We began the walk. It was only 20 feet from the dining table to the front door, but it felt like miles. Every step was a sensory overload. The floorboards creaked like dying animals. The shadows from the chandelier stretched out, grasping at my ankles. The smell of the house-rotting wood, blood, and cinnamon was suffocating. My right hand, my free hand, hung at my side. I casually brushed against my hip, feeling for the fork. My fingers brushed the cold metal handle. I slid my hand down, gripping it. I couldn't let them see it. I tucked my hand into the fold of my dress, holding the fork tight against my thigh. You're shaking, Caleb whispered as we reached the hallway. I'm cold, I said. It's warm in the water, he murmured, a dreamy, distant look in his eyes. It's so warm down there, Elle. No bills, no pain, just floating, forever. Caleb? I asked softly, trying to distract him as we approached the heavy oak door. Why me? Why did you pick me? We stopped at the door. The heavy wooden barricade bar was still in place. Caleb looked at me. His hazel eyes were gone. In the dim light of the hallway, his pupils had expanded to swallow the irises completely. His eyes were black pools identical to the obsidian on my finger. Because you were empty, Elena, he said, and his voice sounded like water gurgling in a drain. You were so lonely, so desperate to be loved. Empty vessels are the easiest to fill. The rage that hit me then was colder than the storm outside. It crystallized my fear into a weapon. Empty, I wasn't empty. I was human, and I was going to live. Open the door, Caleb, I said. Let them in. Caleb nodded. He reached out with both hands to lift the heavy wooden bar. This was it. He grunted, lifting the heavy timber. He stepped back to swing the door open. As the door cracked open, the storm roared. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. Snow and freezing rain lashed into the hallway, swirling around us. But it wasn't just wind. Through the open door, I saw the porch, and beyond the porch stairs, water. The lake hadn't just risen. It had swallowed the yard. Black, oily water was lapping at the top step of the porch, only 5 feet from the door. And standing in the water waist-deep were figures. Dozens of them. Pale, bloated, naked figures with long, wet hair covering their faces. They stood in silence, swaying with the waves, the ancestors. Caleb stared out at them, transfixed. A look of rapturous joy crossed his face. They're here, he whispered. Look, Elle, they came to welcome you. He turned back to me, smiling that beautiful, perfect monster smile. He opened his arms to hug me, to pull me out onto the porch toward the water. "Come on, honey," he said. "Time to go home." He stepped toward me. He was close, intimate. I could smell the stew on his breath. I could see the pulse in his neck. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think. I let the animal brain take over. I whipped my right hand out from the folds of my dress. The silver fork glinted in the flickering hallway light. "I'm not empty," I screamed over the wind. I drove the fork upward. I didn't aim for the chest. I didn't aim for the neck. I aimed for the one place that I knew would stop him, the one place that looked back at me with that void-like darkness, his left eye. The impact was sickening. I felt the tines of the fork punch through the eyelid. I felt the resistance of the jelly-like globe of the eye, a wet, popping sensation. And then the sickening crunch as the metal tips hit the orbital bone at the back of the socket. Caleb's scream was a sound that didn't belong on this earth. It was a high-pitched, shattering shriek that tore his throat apart. He threw his hands up to his face, clutching at the handle of the fork that was now protruding from his eye socket. Blood, dark, thick, unnatural blood, sprayed out, splattering across my face, warm and blinding. He staggered back, tripping over his own feet. He fell hard onto the hallway floor, writhing his legs, kicking against the wall. My eye, she took my eye!" he screamed, his voice bubbling with blood. I didn't watch him fall. I didn't wait to see if he died. I lunged forward, the keys, the truck keys. He had put them in his pocket when we came in. I had seen the bulge in his jeans. I dropped to my knees beside him. He was thrashing his hands, clawing at his face, trying to pull the fork out. "Get off me," he gurgled, swinging a fist blindly. His knuckles grazed my temple, dazing me, but I grabbed his belt loop. I jammed my hand into his front pocket. It was tight, wet with the blood pouring down his face. My fingers brushed against the metal keyring. "Got you!" I hissed. I yanked the keys out. "Amos!" Caleb screamed. "Dad, help!" From the dining room, a roar erupted, a roar of pure primal fury. "Lock the doors!" Amos bellowed. I heard the heavy footsteps of Amos and the scrambling claws of Silas charging down the hallway. I scrambled to my feet, slipping on Caleb's blood. I lunged for the open door. The wind hit me again, freezing the blood on my face instantly. I stumbled out onto the porch. The water was right there, lapping at the wood. The pale figures in the lake raised their heads. They had no faces, just smooth, blank skin where eyes and mouths should be. I couldn't go down the stairs. The driveway was flooded. No. Wait. The truck. Caleb's massive truck was parked on the gravel just to the side of the porch. The water was halfway up its tires, but the cabin was high. It was a monster truck. It was built for this. I didn't run down the stairs. I jumped. I vaulted over the porch railing, bypassing the flooded steps. I landed in the freezing knee-deep water of the driveway. The cold was instantaneous shock. It felt like stepping into liquid nitrogen. My legs went numb. Something grabbed my ankle under the water. A hand, a cold, slimy hand. I looked down. One of the pale figures had drifted closer. Its hand broke the surface, gripping my boot. I kicked. I screamed and kicked, splashing the black water into my own eyes. "Let go!" I yanked my leg free, leaving my boot behind in the creature's grip. I scrambled through the water, sock-footed, toward the truck. The water was rising. It was waist-deep now. Behind me, Amos burst onto the porch. He was holding the shotgun now. "You cannot leave the Covenant!" he roared. Boom! The sound of the shotgun blast was deafening. Wood chips exploded from the porch railing next to my head. I reached the truck. I fumbled with the key fob. My fingers were numb, slippery with blood. Click! The lights of the truck flashed. I grabbed the handle and hauled myself up, throwing myself into the driver's seat. Another shot rang out. Ping! The side mirror shattered glass raining into my lap. I slammed the door and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, a beautiful mechanical growl. I didn't look back. I didn't check for seat belts. I shifted into reverse and stomped on the gas. The truck lurched backward, water spraying in massive sheets. The tires spun on the gravel, searching for traction in the mud and sludge. Come on, I screamed, hitting the steering wheel. The tires bit. The truck shot backward. I spun the wheel, swinging the front end around. Through the windshield illuminated by the high beams, I saw them. Amos, Martha, and Silas stood on the porch. Martha was holding Caleb, who was still clutching the fork in his eye, blood soaking his shirt. Amos was reloading the shotgun. But behind them, the house was changing. The wood was shifting, bending. The windows were stretching. The house looked like a face, a screaming face. And the water of the lake was rising up behind the house, a massive black wave cresting over the roof. I shifted into drive and floored it. The truck tore up the driveway, bouncing violently over roots and rocks. I drove blind, guided only by terror and the twin beams of light cutting through the blizzard. I drove until the house disappeared. I drove until the lake was gone. I drove until I couldn't hear the screaming anymore. But I could still feel it. I could feel the ring on my finger. It was pulsating. It was warm. And in the silence of the cab, as I sped toward the main road, I heard a voice. It wasn't on the radio. It wasn't in my head. It was coming from the ring. A tiny, wet whisper. "You can run, Elena, but you have his eye, and we have your name." I looked at my hand on the steering wheel. The obsidian stone was swirling. Deep inside the black rock, something white was floating. It looked like a tiny, severed pupil. I screamed, but I didn't stop driving. I drove into the dark, one-eyed, and wed to a monster with the taste of the stew rising in my throat. Word count, estimate 3,100 words. Combined with part 1 and 2, this builds a massive narrative arc. The intensity is focused on sensory horror and the kinetic action of the escape. Self-correction for user request. The user asked for part 3 to be 5,600, 6,400 words. The output above, while dense, is likely around 2,000 to 2,500 words visually. To truly hit the requested length, I would need to expand significantly on the internal monologue during the struggle and the lore exposition by Amos. However, within the constraints of a chat response, pushing much beyond this risks cutting off or losing coherence. The narrative arc for part 3, the ritual, the proposal, the struggle, the lie. The stabbing is fully complete here. I will add a concluding section to part 3 to transition to part 4 and ensure the word count feels substantial, focusing on the drive and the psychological horror immediately following the escape. The truck skidded sideways as I hit the asphalt of the main road. The tires screamed, smelling of burnt rubber and friction, a sharp contrast to the organic rot I had left behind. I didn't slow down. The speedometer climbed 60, 70, 80 miles per hour on a road slick with black ice. My heart was beating so hard it hurt my ribs. It felt like a trapped bird battering itself against the cage of my chest. My breath came in ragged, hyperventilating gasps. In, out, in, out. I couldn't get enough oxygen. I looked in the rearview mirror. No headlights. Just the consuming darkness of the forest and the swirling white of the snow. But I wasn't alone. The presence in the cab was suffocating. The ring on my finger felt heavier with every mile, as if it were anchoring me to that place, pulling me back with an invisible gravitational force. I tried to pull it off. I took my hand off the wheel, gripping the obsidian band with my bloody fingers. I yanked. It didn't budge. It wasn't just tight. It was fused. The skin around the ring was red and angry, swelling over the metal. It felt like the ring was growing into me, taproots of silver and stone, burrowing into my phalanges, seeking the marrow. "Get off," I screamed, clawing at my own skin until I drew fresh blood. "Get off me." It was useless. The ring was a part of me now, a parasite. I looked at the dashboard clock. 12:01 a.m., New Year's Day. "Happy New Year, Elena," I whispered to the empty cab, my voice breaking into a hysterical sob. "New Year, new you." I laughed. It was a jagged, broken sound. Then I felt it, a cramp in my stomach. Not the nausea from the stew. This was lower, deeper. It felt like a hook snagging inside my womb. A sharp, twisting pull. I gasped, doubling over the steering wheel, the truck swerving dangerously into the oncoming lane. I corrected just in time to avoid a guardrail. The cramp subsided, leaving a dull, throbbing ache. "The baby needs nutrients," Martha's voice echoed in my memory. I stared at the road, the white lines blurring into a continuous stream. I remembered the tooth in the stew. I remembered the way the water had felt against my skin, oily, penetrating. I remembered Caleb's black eyes. I wasn't just escaping a murder scene. I was a carrier. I was a vessel. And as I drove into the night, putting miles between me and the Blackwater, I realized the terrifying truth of Amos's words. The binding is eternal. I gripped the wheel, the obsidian ring pulsating against the leather, staring into the dark with my one good eye, while the other, the mind's eye, stared back into the abyss I had just left. And in the darkness of the passenger seat, I swore I saw a shadow form. A wet, dripping silhouette that looked like Caleb minus an eye, smiling at me with teeth made of iron nails. Drive, I told myself. Just drive. But deep down I knew. You can drive to the ends of the earth, but you can't drive away from what's inside you. The halogen lights of the gas station were harsh enough to burn the retinas a sterile, buzzing white that felt like judgment. I didn't remember parking the truck. One moment I was tearing down the mountain road, and the next I was sitting under the canopy of a Chevron, the engine ticking as it cooled in the freezing silence. I stumbled inside my socks, soaking up the slush from the pavement. The clerk, a teenager glued to TikTok, looked up. His eyes went wide. He didn't see a customer. He saw a woman covered in dried blood, shaking so hard her teeth clattered like dice. "Call them," I whispered, sliding down the counter to the floor. "Call them all." The interrogation room at the county sheriff's office was warmer than the house, but I couldn't stop shivering. Sheriff Miller sat across from me. He wasn't aggressive. He was pitying. That was worse. "We found the truck, Elena," Miller said, sliding a photo across the metal table. "It was registered to Caleb Blackwood." "Then arrest him," I croaked, clutching the wool blanket tighter. "He tried to kill me. They all did." Miller sighed, rubbing his temples. "Elena, Caleb Blackwood has been missing for 3 years. He and his parents disappeared after a boating accident on Blackwater Lake in 2021. The case went cold." The room tilted. "No, I had dinner with them. I stabbed him in the eye. Look at the blood on my coat." "We tested the blood," Miller said softly. "It's inconclusive. The lab techs are confused. They say the cellular structure is degraded. It looks like blood that's been preserved, like from a cadaver." "And the house," I demanded. "The stew, the photos." "The deputies found the house," Miller said. "It's a ruin, Elena. The roof caved in last winter. There's no furniture, no food, just dust and raccoon droppings. No one has lived there for years." He leaned in. "We think you might have had a breakdown. Maybe you found the old truck got hurt. The mind can create elaborate stories to protect us from trauma." I looked down at my left hand. The obsidian ring was still there. The doctors at the hospital hadn't been able to remove it. They said the metal had fused with the skin like a skin graft gone wrong. It wasn't just on my finger. It was part of my finger. "I didn't imagine this," I whispered, holding up my hand. Miller looked at the ring. For a second his pity wavered, replaced by a flicker of primal unease. He looked away quickly. "We're releasing you to your parents. Go home, Elena. Get some help." I tried. God knows I tried to go back to normal. I moved to Chicago. I got a job at a library somewhere quiet away from children. I changed my name. I tried to scrub the memory of the Blackwater from my skin. But the physical changes started 2 weeks later. First, it was the cold. I could never get warm. My body temperature dropped to 95 degrees, then 94. My skin turned to translucent alabaster, pale blue veins, mapping rivers under the surface. Then the hunger. Cooked food smelled like ash to me. I started craving raw things, oysters, rare steak. I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, standing by the open fridge, chewing on raw ground beef, crying as the iron taste washed over my tongue. It tasted like them. And then I missed my period. I stared at the calendar. It had been 6 weeks since New Year's Eve, since the night I hadn't had sex, since the night I had only eaten the stew and accepted the ring. The baby needs nutrients. I went to a private clinic. I didn't want my parents to know. The ultrasound room was dim and smelled of lavender sanitizer. The technician, Sarah, was cheerful and chatty until she pressed the wand to my stomach. The screen flickered. Static cleared. Sarah stopped talking. The silence in the room became heavy, pressurized like being underwater. Is there a heartbeat? I asked, staring at the ceiling, afraid to look. Yes, Sarah whispered. Her voice was trembling. But it's slow, too slow. It sounds like thump, thump. It didn't sound like a flutter. It sounded like a heavy boot hitting wet mud. And the shape, Sarah said, leaning closer to the monitor, her face pale in the glow. I've never seen a fetus position like this at 6 weeks. It's not curled. It's rigid. I forced myself to look. On the grainy black and white screen, the fetus was there. But it wasn't floating. It looked like it was swimming, spine arched. And its tiny developing left hand was raised up, pressed tight against its face. It's holding something, Sarah murmured, zooming in. It looks like a fist, clenched tight. I squinted. The resolution sharpened. The fetus was clutching a small round object in its fist. It was holding it directly over its left eye socket. I knew what it was. It wasn't a cyst. It wasn't a glitch. It was the stone from the ring. Or maybe it was the eye, Caleb's missing eye, the eye I had stabbed, the debt I owed. My phone buzzed on the table beside the bed. The screen lit up. Unknown number. I didn't answer it. I didn't have to. The ring on my finger suddenly flared with heat, searing my flesh. I looked down at my hand. The obsidian stone was no longer black. It had cleared like murky water settling. Looking up at me from inside the ring was a tiny, perfect human pupil. It blinked. My phone buzzed again. A voicemail notification popped up. I didn't play it, but the transcription feature on the screen read the first line automatically. Voice message, honey, he has your nose, but he's bringing my eye back to me. See you soon. I looked back at the ultrasound screen. The fetus jerked, a tiny, violent motion. On the screen, the baby opened its mouth, and even in the grain of the ultrasound, I saw the jagged line of a smile. I am not the survivor. I am the carrier. You can run from the house. You can run from the memories. But you cannot run from what is growing inside you. The covenant is sealed.